Welcome, and thank you for standing by. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode until the question and answer session of today's conference. At that time, you may press star one on your phone to ask a question. Today's call is being recorded. If you have any objections, please disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the conference over to Stephanie Shearholt. Thank you. You may begin.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Stephanie Shearholt from NASA's Office of Communications. Thank you for joining us today to talk with experts about science investigations and a new privately funded airlock, which are launching on SpaceX's 21st Commercial Resupply Services mission for the agency to the International Space Station. It's actually the first launch under SpaceX's second Commercial Resupply Services contract with NASA, and will for the first time fly the upgraded version of the Dragon spacecraft, which provides more room for science and supplies. The Dragon spacecraft will lift off on a Falcon 9 rocket from Space Launch Complex 39A at NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Here to talk with us today about some of the payloads launching are our experts. For the bioasteroid experiment, we have joining us Dr. Charles Cockell and Dr. Rosa Santamartino. For the Cardinal Heart investigation, Dr. Joseph Wu and Dr. Dilip Thomas. For tests of the HemoQ device, we'll be talking to Dr. Ben Easter. To talk about the NanoRacks Bishop airlock, we have Brock Howe joining us. To discuss how liquid metals behave in microgravity, Dr. Dusan Sekulich and Dr. Sinisha Masarovich will be joining us. And finally, to talk about human brain organoids, Dr. Pinar Messi joins us. Our speakers will provide a brief overview of the research, and we will open the lines for a view question after each speaker to have questions specifically about that investigation. If we have time at the end, we'll open up lines for additional questions. Your phones are on mute now, so to get into any question queue, you can press star one on your phone at any time. The operator will call on you and open your mic so you can ask your question. Please stick to one question, so that everybody has an opportunity to ask. About 1 hour after we conclude today, you can listen to a replay of this teleconference by dialing toll-free 1-800-964-3385. Again, that number is 800-964-3385. To get us started, we're going to hear from David Brady, the Associate Program Scientist for the International Space Station Program at NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston. He's going to give us an overview of some of the science going up on this mission. So over to you, David.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you for everyone for participating today. We appreciate it. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're supporting. I love events like this because we get to hear directly from our researchers. So my overview is, rather than directly going to introduce their flight projects, my intro is designed to highlight some relevant themes, hopefully some food for thought that'll provide some context for what you're going to hear about today. The human brain is a fascinating machine. If you ever play a game where you have to say the first thing that comes to your mind, you can relate to what I'm about to say. And when I do these type of events, I like to review the list beforehand and try and find a relevant theme to tie it to. The interesting thing was, for today's event, the first thing that came to mind is the something old, something new phrase that folks normally associate with weddings. Appropriately, this launch and this time frame in spaceflight represents a wedding of the old and the new. As you know, the International Space Station just celebrated its 20th anniversary of continuous human presence. So anyone who's 20 years of age or younger has always lived in a time when humans were living and working in space. So going back to the something old, something new theme, I just want to point out that old doesn't have to have a negative connotation. And this usage, the use of the space station over the last 20 years, refers to a well-established, reliable platform for generating benefits for humanity. And that includes terrestrial application, enabling exploration, for example, through our Artemis program, pursuing basic research and technology, as well as fostering new markets in low Earth orbit so that NASA can eventually become one of many customers. Another interesting thing to compare and contrast is that ISS is celebrating its 20, while SpaceX is flying its 21st mission. which represents, as Stephanie mentioned, a new cargo vehicle from our commercial partners. Note that there was a time not that long ago when NASA just working with a commercial partner on this scale was something new. In fact, I consider one of the most important achievements in my time at NASA to be the gusto with which the space community in general, and NASA in particular, seeks to embrace collaboration in all forms. What we do for the benefit of humanity, we do together. And so this is one of the defining aspects of the crossroads between our work in the 20th century versus our work in the 21st century. Together, we're ushering in a new era of space utilization to include science, technology, educational, and economic benefits. You know, Mary Beth Adine, who's my division chief, made a statement not long ago at the ISS Research and Development Conference. And I'm paraphrasing here, but I thought she had a really good breakdown of the lifetime of the space station and what we're moving into in the future. She said something along the lines of, we've had the first decade be the decade of assembly. The second decade was a decade of research initiation, initially doing science. And this decade that we're moving into now is the decade of full utilization of the International Space Station, which this research you're going to hear today represents. I hope I've been able to provide you with some useful content and perspective prior to you hearing the details from our speakers today. My thanks to them and my thanks to you for your participation in today's event. And at this point, let me turn it back over to Stephanie to introduce our first speaker.
Great. Thank you so much, David. So yes, first we will hear from Dr. Charles Cauquel and Dr. Rosa Santamartino. Dr. Cauquel is a professor of astrobiology at the University of Edinburgh and is the principal investigator for BioAsteroid. He is currently director of the UK Centre for Astrobiology and formerly worked at NASA's Ames Research Centre and the British Antarctic Survey. His lab studies life in extreme environments and the habitability of other worlds, including human space settlement. Dr. Santamartino is a postdoctoral research scientist in space microbiology at the University of Edinburgh. She has a PhD in molecular biology, and during her years of research, she has worked in the UK, the US, Italy, France, and Mexico. She is involved in the design, preparation, and post-flight analysis of BioAsteroid and the previous space station experiment, BioRock. BioAsteroid aims to better understand how microbes interact with and change asteroids, information that could be used for future mining on asteroids. So now I will turn it over to Dr. Cauquel.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephanie and David, for the introduction. And I just want to give you a brief 2 or 3 minute summary of the BioAsteroid experiment that Rosa and I have been preparing. So Stephanie said this is an experiment to study the biomining of elements from asteroidal material. About 20% of the world's copper and 5% of the world's gold is extracted from rocks today using microorganisms that are an environmentally efficient way of getting economically interesting elements from rocks. And we want to know, can we do this from asteroidal material? And it follows the successful BioRock experiment that we sent to Space Station last year, in which we successfully demonstrated the extraction of rare earth elements from basalt, which is a common rock found on the Moon and Mars. That was published in Nature Communications last week. So in this experiment, we're going to be sending up 12 of our miniature bioreactors. This is some hardware that we developed for the BioRock experiment. And in those reactors, we're going to have crushed up meteorite, essentially real asteroid material. And then in those containers are going to be 2 microorganisms, a bacterium and a fungus, and also the combination of the 2 of them. We're interested to see whether communities of microbes can help us break down that material. Why do we want to do this in microgravity? Because microgravity affects the way in which fluids behave. In space, you do not have, or in microgravity, you do not have the sedimenting out, the settling out of microbes, and you do not have convection. So that lack of fluid movement affects microbes and therefore indirectly affects the way in which they interact with rocks. And we want to address hypotheses about how that interaction of microbes and fluids affects their ability to biomine rocks and therefore our ability to extract elements from asteroids. So why are we wanting to do this? We want to contribute towards the long-term human exploration and settlement of space. It's not yet economical to go to asteroids and mine them and bring those elements back to the Earth. But if we want to establish permanent human settlements beyond the Earth, we're going to have to do mining. You have to do mining to get elements, whether it's iron in your rovers or rare earth elements in your mobile phones. Mining is a fact of life for a civilization. And if we want to break away from the Earth and establish self-sustaining human settlements, settlements, we need to do mining. So in this experiment, we're looking at whether we can harness the power of microorganisms to do mining of asteroids. And what benefit does this have to research on Earth? Well, we gain fundamental new insights into how microbes grow and form biofilms over rocks, how they interact with rock material. And by studying these organisms in microgravity, we get an idea of what effect gravity has on the formation of microbial biofilms and growth on the Earth. Biofilms that foul your pipes, foul industrial plants, and get in the way of many domestic and industrial processes. So it's really fundamental that we understand how microbes grow and what effect gravity on the Earth plays in the way in which these microbial communities develop. And of course, by studying microorganisms and how they biomine in space, we get new insight into the mechanisms and way in which microbes can do biomining, which could be applied to environmentally sensitive biomining on the Earth that releases us from the need to use compounds like cyanides and other toxic compounds that have traditionally been used in biomining. So that's really the bioasteroid experiment, looking to see whether we can use microbes to extract economically important elements in support of the long-term human exploration and settlement of space, and also fundamental insights into biomining and microbiology on the Earth. Thank you very much, Stephanie.
Okay, great. And we do already have some reporters in the queue to ask questions about bioasteroid. If you would like to join them, please press *1 on your phone. I'll call out the order of questions we have. Please stick to one question, and then we'll keep it moving. So first is Russell Pounds from Pacific Rim Media.
Thanks, Stephanie, and great presentation, Dr. Cockell. I know that some of the other experimenters that have sent things up for experimentation in microgravity have done some simulations on Earth. Can you describe any proof of concept tests you may have done with your experiment to back on Earth to try to prepare for this experiment on the space station?
Yeah, that's a good question. So on the Earth, we do experiments in the laboratory, looking and seeing how the microbes behave under 1G. We could also do experiments looking at simulated microgravity using apparatus like clinostats and random positioning machines. The problem with these approaches is they mix fluid. They cause shear stress that you don't see in microgravity. So with microbial growth in fluids that do not experience sedimentation or convection, the only way to do this experiment for real is really to go into space. And this is why the International Space Station is so crucial, because we can never truly simulate microgravity or the gravity on asteroids on the ground. We can try and approximate it, but ultimately we have to go into space. We have done ground-based experiments in our laboratory, but we really need to go into space to find out how they really behave.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Next, we have a question from Susie Nielsen from Business Insider.
Hello, thank you. This is actually a question for David Brady, and it's not quite as science-focused, but I wanted to ask about what the sleeping situation is on the ISS currently, because I know Commander Hopkins said that he's sleeping in Resilience right now, but there might be new sleeping quarters coming up, so I was just wondering what the situation is about that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I actually don't have any information on that right now. I do know that we plan ahead in order to make sure we have sleeping locations for all our crews. We've done that since the days of shuttle. So I'll have to get back to you on that one, because that was not, since it's a non-science question, I wasn't prepared to take that today, but I'm sure Stephanie and I would be happy to get back to you later in order to get you to answer that question.
Yeah, and Susie, the short version is Hopkins said that, you know, he was the chosen person to sleep in the Dragon. It's sort of harkens back to the tradition in shuttle, in which the commander slept in the cockpit. And there is work underway to bring another sort of what they sometimes referred to as a coffin, the sleeping quarters, up to the space station. So that's in work, but I don't think it's been manifested yet. So we'll get back to you. Okay, the next question in the queue comes from Keith Cowing from NASAWatch.com.
Hi, question for Dr. Cockell. First of all, hello, Charlie. Good to hear from you again.
Hey, Keith. Good to hear from you. Yeah.
Well, first thing, listening to what you're putting together and looking at the pictures, I'm thinking right off the bat of our time up in Devon Island in a remote environment where we had a lot of stuff that we had to get rid of, and we pretty much hauled it out in an airplane. It looks, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that you've got a little composting cell there, and I'm wondering if once you understand the basic operations of this thing in microgravity, the fluids and the shearing and all, or lack thereof, have you thought of scaling this up? And it seems to have a dual purpose in that other materials, including maybe compacted human waste or other materials, or things that are 3D printed using organic compounds that can be degraded. This would be something that might be interesting to incorporate into an advanced life support system. Have you thought of that? Is that down your path of what's next, or is this just simply looking at basic microbe mineral interactions in zero gravity?
No, there's definitely applications in other bioindustrial processes such as life support, not just biomining. And as you say, one could break down these rocks and think about soil formation. Actually, I'd like to bring in Rosa at this point and give her a chance to say a few things, because she's had ideas on looking at these rocks and how they might be used to see what things could be leached for soils and other industrial processes. So, Rosa, would you like to say something?
Yes, thank you, Todd. So thanks for the question. I think this is actually a very good point, because experiments such as bioasteroid and biorockfors are really, so they get the attention because of the space biomining, and that's great. But I think that the goal is also to try and understand how micromineral interaction can help, for instance, recycling of several elements, for instance, from electronic devices and so on. So I think that that's a very good aim that we have to address from this point of view. And I think this is going to be important from the point of view of creating a sustainable life support system in space. So yes, this is definitely something that we are going to look, particularly with bioasteroids.
Thank you both. Next question comes from Christina Anderson from AWPS News.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. So I was just wondering if there would be special handling that would be needed for the microbes. It seems like they might be prone to expire under certain conditions, making them less useful. So if so, what kind of special handling might there be required? And then I wanted to know if there's going to be more than one bioasteroid experiment undertaken in this cycle, and if so, what the differences might be that are being investigated. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I'll take the second part and get Rosa to answer the first part about the handling of the microbes and how we deal with them. I'll briefly answer the second part, which is this is looking at chondrite. It's an L-chondrite, which is a very common type of asteroidal material. So that's the focus of this bioasteroid experiment. The great thing about the hardware we've developed is it's small and compact. We flew it in BioRock, and we have plans to fly it again in the future. And this is what's wonderful about this hardware, is we can now fly many of these experiments looking at different types of rocks, different types of microbes, as Keith raised as well, expanding into other areas beyond biomining, like cycling of elements for life support systems or breaking down rocks to make soil on the moon. So this is a very versatile piece of equipment. I'll hand over to Rosa just to explain about the handling of the microbes and how long they survive for.
Yeah, so thanks for the question. So we actually chose on purpose some microorganisms that perform bioleaching, but they also have some characteristics. For instance, they can resist desiccation. So we know that when we prepare them, they are going to resist in their desiccated state on the asteroid rocks for several months. So that's one thing that is very useful for us, because it doesn't mean that it means that we don't have to reintegrate the samples over and over and over every time we have a scrub in the launch. And they are also safe microorganisms. This is how we selected them on purpose. That means that they are safe for the crew, safe for us to study in the laboratory, and they also require very mild temperatures and, in general, like pH conditions. So they are very good microorganisms for more than one use, I would say. Thank you.
you. Next question comes from Jackie Goddard of the Times of London.
Hello. So asteroid mining is projected to be the first trillion-dollar industry, and using microbes to extract metals and minerals off Earth sounds kind of futuristic and kind of primitive and organic all in one go. I'm trying to get my head around the logistical side of biomining in space. And my question is, how many microbes does it take to mine an asteroid? I'm trying to kind of understand the scope of it. And are there challenges to introducing life from Earth into an environment off Earth? And I'm talking beyond laboratory conditions on the ISS.
Yes, so there are many sort of strands to that. So let me just try and pick out a couple and summarize. The first thing to really stress, this is very important, is we're not, in this experiment, or in fact in general, we're not interested in developing methods to mine asteroids to bring materials back to the Earth. I know people talk about this trillion-dollar business. At the moment, it's not clear that that's economically viable, partly because if you bring back a trillion-dollar astronaut, presumably you crash the market price of whatever you're trying to sell, but that's a sort of separate discussion. But our focus is really in how can we use resources locally, sometimes called in situ resource utilization or living off the land. If human beings are to move beyond the Earth, they're going to have to mine local resources to support human settlement, regardless of whether that's economically viable to bring back to Earth or not. It's going to be a necessary step in the long-term establishment of a human presence in space. So that's really our focus, independent of any economic argument. So in terms of the practicalities, yes, of course things cannot grow in the local environment on the Moon, Mars, or asteroids. This would have to be done in a giant container or a vat. So you would crush up your rocks, add it into a vat, and you add your microbes. Now, how many microbes you need? Well, you need trillions, but of course microbes grow to vast numbers. This is why biomining works on the Earth. Microbes themselves are small, but the population sizes that you get in a lump of rock, for example, are enormous. And this is why microbes are able to do economically relevant mining on the Earth, because the microbes have been eating rocks for billions of years to get nutrients out, so they break down the rocks, and as a consequence, the elements of interest are released on the Earth, like copper and gold, rare earth elements. So the microbes are working in vast numbers to do this process. And on a place like an asteroid, you would essentially take a vat there, a large container, you'd crush up the rocks, you'd put it in there, you'd add your microbes, they would grow, and they would do the mining, and then you would take the leachate, which is the liquid that they release from the rocks, and extract your economically interesting elements, just as you would on the Earth. And of course, there are many logistical questions in doing that, and problems. The experiment on the space station is by no means an economic experiment. It's a demonstration of the scientific principle of biomining, and there would be many more steps and requirements to scale that up to some sort of industrial scale process that could be useful for a self-sustaining human settlement. I don't know whether that answered your question.
I think that's very thorough. Thank you, Dr. Cockel. Next, we have a question from Marcia Dunn of the Associated Press.
Yes, hello. I assume you're not going to be flying trillions of microorganisms. How many, more or less, are you flying? And what is the quantity of the crushed material that you're taking up, and how old is this asteroidal material? Where did it come from? And is there any astronaut participation in this experiment at all? Thank you.
Yeah, again, I'll split that. I'll tell you the asteroidal material is 4.5 billion years old, and it's chondrite from the formation of the solar system itself. Of course, we didn't go and get the asteroid material. It's meteorite that landed on the Earth, and we're using as pristine material as we can. Of course, it would be nice to use absolutely fresh asteroid material, but I don't think the OSIRIS-REx team are going to give us fresh material to feed to microbes anytime soon, but maybe in the future that's possible. So we have to make use of fresh meteorite that's landed on the Earth, and that's the material that we use. So I'm going to pass over to Rosa. She can tell you a little bit about the extent to which the material is crushed and how many microbes are on the rocks and how they grow up.
Yes, so the amount of cells I can tell you is a concentration. It's a number, and it's about 1 to sometimes 5 billion microorganisms per milliliter. But they are very small, so imagine how big they are. And we are going to have a total amount of 5 ml, so you can do your calculation on that. And from the point of view of how much rock material, is going to be around 1 gram of crushed rocks. This is because of how it's basically the number of rocks and material we can use is limited by the hardware that we are going to use, but that's pretty good for our purpose that, as Charles said, is to try and understand which is the mechanism behind that.
And I think the other part of the question was, are the astronauts involved in any of the investigation?
All right. Yes. So, Charles, do you want me to answer this?
Sure. Go ahead, Rosa. Yeah.
Okay. So, well, actually, very little this time. So, the hardware that we developed is almost completely automated, and both the start and the end of the experiment are triggered by inputs between the hardware and the cubic incubator on board the ISS. So basically, the crew will only need to integrate the hardware into the cubic before the experiment and collect them back for their storage and their return to Earth.
Great, thank you. And the last question for BioAsteroid at the time is Mark Carreau from Aviation Week in Space Technology.
Yes, thanks. How long will your material need to be in space for this first phase of this experiment?
Yeah, so the active phase of the experiment is about 19 days. BioRock last year was 21 days. So it's a sort of 3-week time period when the microbes do their mining of the rock. And that gives them long enough to grow up, to fill the culture chamber, and then to sit there for about 2 weeks. They take 3 or 4 days to reach a good cell concentration in the medium, and then they have just over 2 weeks to be interacting with the rock and doing the mining experiment. So just to reiterate again, just to summarize a couple of points that have come up in the last few minutes. This is, of course, a proof of concept experiment. So we've got a gram of rock. They're growing for 3 weeks, and there's 5 milliliters of liquid. So we're very far off a full-scale commercial biomining operation, but the principles are exactly the same, occurring on a small scale. So over the 3 weeks, we have long enough to see whether the microbes improve leaching of the elements compared to a sterile control. I should say there's a sterile control in the experiment where there's no microbes that allows us to get the background leaching from the rock without the microorganisms.
A fascinating discussion. Thank you for sharing all of that. Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Next, we will move on to our next investigation. We'll hear from Dr. Joseph Wu, who is the principal investigator for Cardinal Heart, and Dr. Dilip Thomas. Dr. Wu is professor and director of the Stanford Cardiovascular Institute. He is a cardiologist, and his lab works on stem cells, tissue engineering, and genomics for precision medicine. Dr. Thomas is the Cardinal Heart team lead from Dr. Wu's lab at the Stanford Cardiovascular Institute. His expertise in building mini human heart tissue models as a surrogate to understand heart tissues and for drug testing. Cardinal Heart will study the effects of microgravity on heart tissue using tissue chips in an effort to develop therapies on Earth and countermeasures for future space exploration. Dr. Wu, Dr. Thomas, over to you.
So thank you very much, Stephanie. I'm very pleased to present on the Cardinal Heart along with my postdoc fellow, Dilip Thomas. Just to give you a background, the Cardinal Heart team consists of investigators from Stanford, my colleagues Beth Pruitt at UC Santa Barbara, Stephanie Countryman, and Louise Azea from the BioServe Space Technologies. We've been working diligently over the past 2 years to come to this very exciting point of our project, which is the launch of the SpaceX CRS-21 that will carry our human heart tissues to the International Space Station. This is the background for the audience. The microgravity on the International Space Station can have several physiological consequences. For example, on Earth, our blood tends to pool in our legs due to gravity. In space, the fluid will shift from the lower part of your body, for example, your legs, to the upper chest, to the neck, and to the face. And because there's more blood return to the heart, the stroke volume and the cardiac output increases by about 20 to 30%. However, your blood pressure may actually decrease because your blood vessels are dilated because there's less peripheral resistance. And over a long period of time, it is possible that the combined effect of weightlessness and space radiation may accelerate atherosclerosis, cardiac ischemia, and cardiac arrhythmia. And these are the questions that we need to find out, especially if our eventual goal is to travel to Mars and other planets. Now, while we have some idea of the physiology of microgravity on the human heart, We actually don't know a whole lot about the genetic, molecular, and cellular effects. And that's because we simply cannot take biopsies of our astronauts' heart tissues before and after going to the space station. And as an alternative, we and others have developed techniques whereby we convert patients' skin or blood cells to induce the pluripotent stem cells, or iPS cells. These iPS cells are pluripotent and can be differentiated into essentially all cell types in our body. And for our purpose, we differentiate these iPS cells into beating heart cells that are genetically masked to the same donor. And this is crucial because we can now understand the genetic variability of heart function from person to person. So back in July 2016, as part of the SpaceX CRS-21 launch, we actually sent iPS cell-derived heart cells from 3 healthy individuals. It was actually the first time that human iPS cell-derived heart cells were sent to space. The work was also done in collaboration with our partner, BioServe Technology, and also with the Center for the Advancement of Science in Space, or CASIS. And then these beating hearts were grown 2-dimensionally on a tissue culture dish, and then they were analyzed after about 4.5 weeks in the space station. We were able to gather very useful and insightful information, for example, showing that the microgravity can induce changes in cellular contractility, the cardiomyocyte beating rate, and then the cardiomyocyte gene expression changes. So what's new for this launch in December? Well, instead of 3 individuals, we have now increased to 6 individuals, 3 males and 3 females. And then more importantly, instead of a 2-dimensional monolayer of only heart cells, we're now sending 3-dimensional engineered heart tissues that consist of iPS cell-derived heart cells, endothelial cells, and fibroblasts from these 6 individuals. As you know, the heart, just like any other organ in our body, is very complex, and it's composed of various cell types. So it's important that we study all these 3 cell types at the same time. And in total, we'll be sending 192 engineered heart tissues, or you can call it 192 small chunks of human heart tissue to the space station. We're very excited about this because after our initial launch in 2016, the second phase of our study will allow us to better understand the effects of microgravity on these human heart tissues on the genetic, molecular, cellular, and functional level. And then lastly, I think the audience may ask, what do we expect to see and what's next after this? Well, I would assume that we'll likely see some adverse effects due to the microgravity on these human heart tissues. And for that reason, we want to precisely understand what they are, how long they last, and what can be used to prevent these changes. So in the future, we'll be screening for medications that can potentially block some of these negative effects of microgravity-induced cardiac muscle atrophy. And that way we'll come up with protective measures for our astronauts in the short run and potentially for our space travelers in the long run. So thank you very much for your attention.
Great, thank you. Reminder to reporters, if you'd like to ask a question about Cardinal Heart, please press *1 to get in the queue. While we give them a moment to queue up, I have a question, which is, how are these mini human heart tissues different from a chunk of patient heart tissue from a biopsy?
Yeah, so I want to give my postdoc, Dilip, a chance to speak. So Dilip, you want to answer that?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So that's a great question. So heart biopsies are performed usually in the clinic through a catheter inserted to one's heart. Although this is a very routine procedure in many clinical settings, it has several risks associated with it and cannot be carried out without any clinical premise or need. However, using the iPSC-derived cells, which are obtained by reprogramming cells from the blood or skin, we can make the same patient's heart cells using this technology and differentiating them into this cardiovascular cell type. So using this much easier and non-invasive method, we can still obtain very characteristic functional replica of a human heart muscle by generating the cells first and then putting them together into a naturally derived extracellular matrix, which is commonly present in our body.
Fascinating. And we have Christina Anderson from AWPS News with a question.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. So could you make the connection, please, between the work that's happening on the station and how this might end up in therapeutics on Earth? And thank you.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think, as you know, in space, because of the microgravity, because of the radiation effect, on space, there's this phenomenon of accelerated aging, and this accelerated aging occurs not just in the heart, but also in your blood vessels and pretty much all the organs. And that's why it's a very stressful environment for our astronauts. And so the findings that we get from sending these human, chunks of human heart tissues into space and then recovering them when they come back will allow us to see what the changes are. And it's almost like simulating accelerated cardiac aging. And based on these changes, then we can then screen for medications that can be used to prevent that. Otherwise, on Earth, you could probably do similar experiments, but it would probably take you much longer period of time and without the actual environment of microgravity and space radiation.
Could I have a follow-up?
Yes.
So are you using drugs on the tissue samples at this point, or is that something planned for the future? Thank you.
That's something for the future, but Dylan, if you want to answer the exact study design.
Yeah, sure. So we are sending these engineered heart tissues, as Joe described, from 6 individuals, 3 males and 3 females. And half of these samples are going to be run as controls on Earth for the same period of time. These samples are going to be at the International Space Station. And the samples at the International Space Station, some of them will be terminated at the station just to capture the acute effects of microgravity and long-term effects after 4 weeks in the space station. And some of those samples will return live back to the lab. So these are the samples that we want to thoroughly look at the functional aspect and see what has changed in comparison to the to its ground control. And should we observe any dysfunction that has caused due to the exposure of microgravity, we are going to test 3 classes of cardioprotective drugs, and these are going to be statins, ACE inhibitors, and beta blockers. These are clinically FDA-approved drugs that are currently in clinical use, and we'll be testing those out to see if we can alleviate the effects of microgravity and bring those samples to the same functional level as their ground counterparts.
Okay, that's fascinating. We don't have any additional questions at this time, so we'll move on to our next investigation. But if you want to ask a question of Dr. Wu and Dr. Thomas, we'll have Q&A again at the end of the call. So moving on, we have Dr. Ben Easter. He is Assistant Professor of Emergency Medicine at the University of Colorado School of Medicine and Deputy Element Scientist for Exploration Medical Capability, the group within the NASA Human Research Program charged with designing medical systems for exploration spaceflight missions. He'll discuss HemoQ, a commercial off-the-shelf blood analysis device to advance the crew's ability to meet their healthcare needs in autonomous fashion on future exploration missions, including for NASA's Artemis program to the moon. Dr. Easter?
Well, thank you, Stephanie, for that introduction, and good morning to everyone from Denver. The experiment that I'm going to tell you about today is really in the realm of space medicine and involves demonstrating a new blood analysis capability for helping us to diagnose medical conditions in astronauts. As you heard, the specific device itself is called HemoQ, and this is a commercial off-the-shelf device that's used to count the number and the types of white blood cells in a blood sample. White blood cells are an important component of the body's immune system and help us to fight infections. A white blood cell count as the lab test is actually one of the most commonly performed lab tests here on Earth. In the emergency room where I work, virtually any patient who has blood drawn will have a white blood cell count performed as part of their panel of lab tests. The reason it's such a common laboratory test is because they really have many clinical uses. White blood cell counts can help us to diagnose infection. They can help clinicians to assess the severity of a medical condition, and they can also be used over time to track responses to treatment. Although it's a very common test, most white blood cell counts on the ground are actually performed in a sophisticated laboratory, like you might find in a hospital. What's unique about the HemaQ device is it's actually designed to be used at the point of care or at the bedside where the blood sample is drawn. You take blood from a venous blood sample or from a finger stick, you put the sample into the HemaQ machine, and 3 minutes later you have an answer on the number and types of white blood cells in the sample. Despite how useful that can be, we actually don't have this capability in spaceflight today. What's challenging and the reason that we need to do this particular experiment is that we don't know if the HemaQ device will work in microgravity. Like almost all medical devices, it was developed for the standard gravitational environment here on Earth and relies on that standard gravity environment for fluids to move and behave in very specific ways. And as we transition the device to weightlessness and that fluid behavior changes, we don't know if the device will function as intended or report accurate results. So our experiment is to fly HemaQ to the space station and test it against 3 different control solutions that have known white blood cell counts and determine if the device functions properly and also if it reports accurate results. If the experiment is successful, this will add to our ability to provide medical care in spaceflight and also take us one step closer to having a comprehensive medical system for supporting astronauts on the way to the moon and Mars. And I am happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Great, that sounds very exciting. As a reminder, please press *1 to get into the queue to ask a question. Dr. Easter, what types of medical conditions would this device help us to diagnose?
And it's a great question. There's really a very wide range of uses of white blood cell counts. Most commonly in the clinical setting, we use these to help us diagnose infections or sepsis, which is a life-threatening systemic infection. But they can also be used to track responses to treatment over time. For example, terrestrially, patients receiving chemotherapy, we can use a white blood cell count to monitor response to treatment or side effects. And then there are also particular conditions that would be unique to space flight. So, for example, if the crew were exposed to a large solar particle event and had a large acute dose of radiation, the white blood cell count actually provides us some information on what their clinical course might look like after that radiation exposure.
Thank you. We have a question from Marcia Dunn from the Associated Press.
Yes, hello. I'm wondering, is your device currently used anywhere on Earth in extreme remote locations, I'm thinking? And what is the soonest, if your experiment goes well, what is the soonest that you think you could have one ready to actually test on astronauts aboard the space station? And will you just keep this device up there, or are you bringing it back? Thank you.
Sure. Happy to answer those. I don't know if this specific device is being used at remote and extreme environments around the world, but certainly this type of device, the idea of using small compact devices that can be immediately used at the point of care to provide clinical information. And this type of clinical information, blood counts or chemistry panels for blood or analyzing urine, that type of testing is absolutely being done in these environments. In terms of your other questions in the plan for this particular experiment, we are actually planning to bring this experiment and the hardware back after it's concluded. And the reason for that is really twofold. You're certainly right that we do ultimately hope to transition it to tried and true clinical use. But the limitations are, number one, we need to be able to analyze the data and inspect the device to make sure that it functioned appropriately. And then the second limiting factor is that the control solutions that we are going to be testing the device against actually have a limited shelf life of about 3.5 months. So we need to bring those back. And then if ultimately the experiment is successful, we will be able to fly the device for clinical care.
Okay, thank you. And the next question comes from Russell Towns from Pacific Rim Media.
Good morning, Dr. Easter. Calling from Alaska today. It's exciting thinking about what the new discoveries will come back with on how the HemoQ device works in microgravity. Have there been some surprises that you've noted as you've prepared for this experiment that might be interesting to consider at this point? Thanks.
I'm not sure if there are specific surprises or if you have a more specific category that you're referring to. We know that the device works terrestrially and is used in clinical settings and is approved by regulatory agencies. So this is actually an example of in many other scientific experiments we talk about doing the experiment in space and bringing the results to the ground. This is an example where we have a commercial off-the-shelf device that's validated for clinical care on the ground, and we are trying to transition it to spaceflight. To ensure that the device is safe and won't cause unanticipated problems on the space station, it's subjected to a whole range of testing related to things like flammability or noise or vibration, or to make sure it won't cause electromagnetic interference with other operational hardware or experiments on the space station. But the particular dynamics of the fluid movement, which are so necessary for laboratory or blood tests, that is something that we can't test here on Earth in a 1G environment. And also some of our analogs, for example, parabolic flight, where we get 20 seconds of weightlessness at a time, that 20 seconds is simply not enough time for this device to function. So we need that longer exposure to microgravity.
Okay, thank you. We will now move on, shift gears a little bit from medical to technology. So we'll hear from Brock Howe. He's the program manager for the NanoRacks Bishop Airlock. Brock has been a program manager with NanoRacks for more than 5 years and has more than 30 years of designing and building spacecraft hardware and systems with a focus on the commercialization of space. The Bishop Airlock is the first privately funded module to be delivered to the space station, and it will support science experiments, satellite deployment, and spacewalks. Brock?
Okay, great. Thank you, Stephanie. And I'll provide a brief overview of the NanoRacks Bishop Airlock. As Stephanie mentioned, it's the next generation NanoRacks payload facility, and therefore is not direct science per se, unlike some of the other discussions today, but rather an expansion of the ISS to perform that science. As David and Stephanie mentioned earlier, we're celebrating 20 years of the ISS. It's been a world-class laboratory in low Earth orbit. And I think it's pretty neat that it's not sitting idly with the same capabilities as it's always had, but rather expanding in its abilities to perform that science in LEO. So the NANORAX airlock represents the latest expansion of these capabilities, but what really is it? The airlock, as you know, is essentially kind of a doorway to move equipment from the inside of the ISS to the outside and vice versa. And the airlock will actually be the fourth airlock on board the ISS. So a little bit of background on ISS. There's two personnel airlocks, one on the Russian segment, one on the U.S. segment. Those are used for their EVAs. There's a third airlock within the Japanese Kibo module, and it's a cargo and experiment airlock. So the Kibo airlock served the ISS well, continue to do so, and NANORAX throughout its lifetime has used the Kibo airlock quite a bit. And so we're very familiar with its operations and how it works, and we've been very satisfied with that. So why a new airlock? About 5 years ago, NANORAX identified kind of a need from customer and market demand for a bigger airlock and one that could be opened a little more frequently than the Kibo one. So to give a quick visualization, I kind of like the kitchen analogy for the size capabilities. The Kibo airlock can transfer a piece of equipment about the size of a microwave oven, whereas this new NANORAX airlock that we've been building will be able to handle something on the size of about a refrigerator or freezer. So it's about 5 times the size of the Kibo airlock. And as Stephanie had mentioned, it will actually be owned and operated as the first commercial module on board the ISS. So the airlock, as we started off on this venture to design the airlock was sized to fit within the volume of the Dragon trunk. So that was one of the critical items during the early design phases of the airlock. We knew we were going to fly in the Dragon trunk, and here we are 5 years later to do that. And so that size, that set the overall diameter and overall height of the airlock. And so we'll be flying uphill, of course, on SpaceX 21 once docked to the ISS. The station arm, the SSRMS, will extract the airlock from the trunk, and they will install the airlock on the Node 3 end cone. So there's an empty port over on the Node 3 end cone on the port side of the vehicle, and we will be berthed there, and we will reside there for the rest of the ISS lifetime. Over its lifetime, the Bishop airlock will be used for several purposes, as Stephanie mentioned as well, deploying satellites, transferring experiments, equipment from the inside of the ISS to the outside, and vice versa. So we go both ways with the equipment, and that allow scientists and even operators and the crew to be able to upgrade equipment if they want to bring them in, and potentially even return those experiments back to the ground to do so. The airlock can also be utilized for technology demonstration payloads and a variety of other uses that we haven't even envisioned yet. So we try to make the airlock design flexible so that it can be used in a variety of different ways down the road. The airlock is also more than just a doorway. It's actually a payload hosting facility as well. We have 6 external payload sites on the outside of the airlock for external payload mounting capabilities, and we also have capabilities to install payloads on the inside of the airlock as well while it's berthed to the ISS. And so it provides a lot of capabilities. We look forward to working with all the scientists, especially the ones on this panel, perform some really cool science on board the ISS. Hopefully the airlock will be able to provide them with capabilities that will enable them to be very creative going forward in space like they've never been before. So bringing in some really cool new stuff there. Finally, we really appreciate NASA and the embrace of commercialization of low Earth orbit. As we mentioned, the first commercial module for the station. So if it wasn't for NASA's support of that commercialization, it'd be very difficult to get here. And we do appreciate that and their support of course, the whole NANORAX airlock program. And again, thank you, Stephanie, for hosting this. It's really been great to be able to get the word out about the airlock.
Well, thank you, Brock. We have a question in the queue from Marcia Dunn from the Associated Press.
Could you provide a cost for your airlock? And I'm wondering, will you be flying it up empty, or will you already have experiments inside ready to go once you reach the space station?
Okay, I'm not at liberty to talk about costs. That's kind of one of the aspects of the commercialization, as I'm sure you know. So I can't really get into cost numbers for the the design and build or for the use of the airlock. And no, it will not actually fly uphill with any payloads. We discussed that early on in the program, and the reason why we kind of avoided it was, one, we didn't want to have payloads waiting for us to fly and the changes in launch schedules and trying to integrate them in. The second reason is a lot of our payload mounts are fairly lightweight structures and easy for crew installation and removal. So we have systems on board to make the crew install the payloads in a simple manner with no tools, and so we didn't want to have those structures have to take those kind of launch loads with the payload already installed in it. So it will fly up empty going uphill and be installed and be ready for operations soon after burning to this ISS.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next question comes from Christina Anderson from AWPS News.
Thank you for taking my question. Could you talk a little bit about the installation of the airlock? Will this all be done with automation, or will there be some astronaut involvement? And how long will it take? That sort of thing. Thank you.
Okay, great. So the actual installation of the airlock, the extraction from the trunk and all the way over to installation on Node 3 will all be done robotically. So there will be no spacewalks associated with it. And those operations will be conducted by the NASA Flight Control Team. Once the airlock is berthed over to Node 3, the crew will then get involved in the airlock. So once they pressurize the airlock, so once we're attached and sealed to the space station, they equalize pressure to the airlock. They will do a series of leak checks. And then once that's done, the crew will be able to open the hatch to the airlock and be able to float inside of airlock. And at that point, they will hook up our hard line, so our cabling that attaches to the space station power and to the space station communication systems will be mated by the crew. And then we will then perform a full checkout and commissioning of the airlock. I expect that total operation from start to finish to take roughly a week or so to get that done. So there's a lot of leak checks and a lot of holds that we have to do and thermal holds that have to go on during the initial commissioning activation, but we will be ready for business within a week after extraction from the trunk.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next question comes from Irene Klotz of Aviation Week.
Thanks. Hi, Brock. I was wondering if you've signed any contracts for Bishop use beyond the ESA NASA pre-purchases that were announced last month. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. So as you mentioned, we have contracts in place for NASA and for ESA to use the airlock. We've also just recently announced our first commercial payload for the airlock. It's a really cool robotic arm technology demonstration payload out of a company called Gitai. Their headquarters in Japan. And they're going to fly up an arm that they've been working on for quite a while. It's been doing some competitions on the ground, but doing tasks that astronauts normally do, getting into lockers, mating connectors, throwing switches, those kind of things. So they've got a really highly mature robot arm, and they're going to bring it up, and we're going to put it inside of the airlock, and it's going to go do some tasks that normally a crew member might do in orbit. And so they can check out the microgravity performance of their robotic arm, and hopefully down the road that arm will be able to assist the crew workload and be able to handle experiments and operate science on board ISS.
That's great. Thank you. The next question is Stephen Clark from Spaceflight Now.
Hi, thank you. Stephen Clark from Spaceflight Now. What sort of cadence of operations can the Bishop airlock support? Like how often can you do a pressurization, depressurization, and put a payload out into the vacuum? And what sort of capability does the airlock have to deploy small sats? Thanks.
Okay. So the cadence of operations, it's we're part of a big global village, if you will. So we're dependent on the space station robotic arm to be able to do our operations for the sortie. So I call it sortie is when we depressurize, go out for an operation, then come back and repressurize. So the airlock itself can support operations at any time. Now, when we're talking about the operations, I expect most payload type operations to be 1 to 2 weeks in duration, when you start the payload install by the crew to all the way to the payload is then removed from the airlock after its science is completed. And then as far as how many times can you do that, you could probably maybe do several of those back to back to back, or you could space them out over months if you need to. It really depends on other activities that the space station arm is tied up doing, whether that's visiting vehicle traffic or other maintenance or EVAs, those kind of things. So we'll be working closely with the NASA team to be able to dictate that cadence of operations. And then the second part of that, can you refresh my memory? I can't remember what the second question was.
Operator, can you reopen Stephen Clark's microphone so he can re-ask the second part of the question?
Yes, Stephen Clark's line is now open. Stephen, if you would like to ask the second part of your question.
Sure, thank you. Just wanted to get your, just wanted to know the airlock's capabilities for deploying small satellites, if any, and if it can, what dimensions, volume, mass could it support, and do you have anything signed up for that? Thanks.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for the reminder. Okay, so as far as capabilities, there's a lot of details out on the NanoRacks website under NanoRacks and the Bishop Airlock, details there. But in general, we can support a payload up to about 700 pounds for a single payload. Now, some of that depends on the jettison policy requirements and the safety requirements levied by the Space Station program, but that's the kind of the largest single deployable satellite that we could deploy right now. Of course, NanoRacks is known for deploying a lot of CubeSats. To give you a volume perspective, right now through the Kibo airlock, we can deploy about 48U worth of CubeSats based on our current CubeSat deployer system. Within the airlock, that capability goes up to about 480U of capability. That's a lot of CubeSats. I don't expect us to deploy that many CubeSats in one sortie, but it gives you an idea, rough perspective of the capabilities. Also, to give a capabilities, we use a Caber class satellite deployer through the Kibo right now. It deploys, again, something about the size of a microwave oven. We can do one of those at a time. The new airlock will be able to do 4 of those at a time. Those are about 60-kilogram type class satellites. That should give you a rough idea of what those can do, and there's a variety of different options that can be done for satellite deployments.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brock. Great stuff. We will now move on. Thank you for everybody who will stick with us. We will continue with the telecon, even though we've reached the top of the hour. We have 2 more exciting investigations for you to hear about, and then we'll have a group Q&A for those who can stick around. So please stick with us. So now we will go to Dr. Dusan Sekulich and Dr. Sinisha Masarovich. Dr. Sekulich is a professor of mechanical engineering, a fellow of the American Society of Mechanical Engineering, and a fellow of the American Welding Society, and is the principal investigator of the 5-year NASA SubSaBrains project. Dr. Masarovich is a professor at Washington State University. His main research interest is in mathematical formulation of problems based on the microphysics of the process and its computational implementation. Specific recent interests include capillary flows, multi-phase flows, phase transformations in solids, granular materials, and plasticity of crystalline materials. They will discuss SubSaBrains, which is an experiment that studies the behavior of liquid metals in microgravity as a first step toward developing techniques that could be used for construction of human space habitats, as well as to repair damage from micrometeoroids or space debris. So, Dr. Sekulich, please start us off.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. As an overview, let me answer 3 questions regarding the brains experiment. These include what is this about, why we do it, and how the research will be conducted. Our science experiment carries the name of our research project titled Brazing Aluminum Alloys in Space. That's why we have this acronym BRAINS. The experimental setting in the International Space Station is in the special hot zone equipment named SAPSA installed in the payload location called Microgravity Science Glove Box inside U.S. Destiny Laboratory module. Why we do it? Before that, let me repeat, we are interested in a behavior of a novel liquid aluminum alloys in zero gravity driven by surface tension. Micrometeoroids and orbital debris impact space vehicles, creating craters and holes. These pose a serious, or may pose a serious threat to astronauts in the habitable module or in the functional inner space domain, typically made of aluminum-based walls, when penetrated. Sealing a hole may be done as a temporary remedy. Of course, everybody remembers duct tape that was recently used. However, how about a permanent seal? Therefore, a method for achieving metallic seal in or over the holes in an aluminum plate is of interest. But in all the traditional bonding materials cases, the amount of molten metal may be small. Filling a larger hole is another matter. The surface tension-driven flow would not be impacted by gravity under conditions at the International Space Station. We must understand the physics of the surface tension-driven flow of a larger mass of aluminum alloy in both space and terrestrial conditions. Well, how the research will be conducted? Inside the SAPSA module ampoules in a sequence, we will have the sealed alumina samples to be exposed to a heating-cooling cycle between, let's say, 70 and 1100 degrees Fahrenheit, which may be between 20 and 600 degrees Celsius, in ultra-high purity nitrogen or in high vacuum. The samples are designed in the form of, let's say, a hole in an aluminum cylinder to be filled with liquid aluminum alloy during the experiment, or aluminum pin to be exposed to a flow of liquid aluminum along the pin, or for that matter, aluminum hollow pin to be exposed again to the flow of liquid aluminum along the pin. The experiments will be executed at the International Space Station and returned to Earth for detailed study, including the surface topography, microstructure, electron microscopy studies, and numerical simulation. I may ask Dr. Mesarovic to add a comment regarding especially regarding the modeling that we are performing.
Okay, go ahead, Dr. Mesarovic.
Okay. Well, here's the main problem. The brazing alloy is in its liquid state. Now, liquids, when they're on Earth, they're primarily driven by gravity. When there is no gravity, it's surface tension and capillary forces that drive the motion of liquid. So when we melt the alloy in space, it is very difficult to control where will it flow. It will cling to the surface, but which direction will it flow? How fast will it flow? And where will it end? So we need to control it. Our modeling is designed to compare situations with and without gravity and to extract the relevant parameters for modeling the flow. So one day we will not have to do experiments. We will be able to simulate that behavior of such fluid in space. So first problem is how to control the flow. Second problem in the absence of gravity is that that brazing alloy, when it melts, has a chemical reaction with the substrate. So it forms bubbles. Now, on Earth, we all know bubbles tend to bubble up, right? Like a ball full of air will float up, well, in water because of buoyancy forces. But when there's no gravity, there's no buoyancy. And in space, when bubbles form on a solid substrate, they will not separate from the substrate. They will grow until they grow to up to the surface, and then it will be punctured, and the surface will flow in. liquid will then flow in. So what we have there is entirely different type of flow in both cases. We need to be able to model that and to predict that behavior, and to predict that behavior for different types of alloys and different types of surfaces where these alloys flow. That's about it.
Yes, let me just finish with the comment. At this point, we have to actually develop the corresponding theory that will describe the phenomena that we observe on terrestrial conditions and compared to the behavior in microgravity conditions. But we are not interested at this point in developing the technology for performing the task related to the use that we are predicting will be relevant. At this point, we are looking at the science because we discovered that some phenomena that may be very specific and important for the technological applications are still not quite clearly explained. And we hope to do that after we get the first results from zero gravity experiment.
That's a great clarification, and this is a biological and physical sciences investigation, so fundamental science. We do have a question from Christina Anderson from AWPS News. A reminder to folks to press *1 to get in the queue to ask your question. Go ahead, Christina.
Thank you for taking my question. There's been a lot of membrane permeability studies over the years. I'm wondering if any of those membrane permeability studies, the data from those studies has been useful at all in trying to answer some of the questions. Of course, it would all be in a gravity environment, which is where the studies have taken place, but just wondering if that might have informed some of the base modeling. Thank you.
Well, yes, indeed. Over the years, we've been involved in the experimental and theoretical numerical, if you wish, simulation and experimental work on processes related to surface tension-driven liquid metals in technological processes like brazing, where brazing actually represents the technological process of bonding two materials using the third one in between them, which is liquid, and then becomes solid. So we did a host of experimental studies of the behavior in terrestrial conditions, and I will give you just one interesting example. We do know that under gravity conditions, we may have micro separation, separation of the phases in the alloy, which is solidifying after being at a higher enough temperature. This separation of phases may happen because of the differences in temperature during cooling and impact of gravity. However, we are looking at the influence of surface tension in doing separation of phases in this particular system. This is entirely, we believe, a new phenomenon that may be quite different in zero gravity conditions. So yes, lots of terrestrial studies have been concluded related to the phenomena that we would like to study in zero gravity conditions.
And if I may add, this is Siniša Mesarovic. There are a few experiments done on International Space Station, in zero gravity, or microgravity, but they're simpler experiments on simpler fluids, water and silicone oil. And we have been using those experiments through NASA's systems to do the first stage of modeling. Thank you.
Thank you. We also have a question from Marcia Dunn from the Associated Press.
Yes, you may have touched on it when you referred to the duct tape, but even right now, the space station has a small air leak on the Russian side. Would this experiment potentially down the road be able, if it works, to be able to fix something like that? How big of a hole could you anticipate fixing if your study goes well? And is there any application you might use for a heat shield on a reentry capsule, for instance, that might be able to keep a capsule intact if it had developed a breach? Thank you.
Yes, this is a great question. Actually, I should say that we do have quite a bit of information about the impact of the debris and other stuff on the surfaces of the man-made objects. And among those, we may experience something what happened with this leak and some other leaks that were recorded. My general answer to that question would be yes, but it's not close tomorrow, so to speak, that we will have the solution. There are many reasons for that. At this moment, we are interested in fundamental, basic scientific study of the behavior of liquid metal under the conditions of zero gravity. And there is lots of other stuff that must be included, let's say selection of the materials, atmosphere conditions, temperature, rates of heating or cooling, and so on, which define the applicability of the process of brazing that I mentioned for the purposes that we are predicting that may become relevant. At this point, I can just say that, yes, indeed, if we do have appropriate source of heat. By the way, NASA at that time, back when the collaboration with Russians was in the previous station active, NASA did support some studies of the bonding using devices that were available at that time. But this technology is something that we have still to develop. General answer is positive to your question, but it's not going to happen soon. We are still in the phase of learning basic phenomena related to the process.
Thank you both. That was really great. So next we'll hear from Dr. Pinar Messi. She is the project scientist in Dr. Allison Moultrie's lab at the University of California in San Diego Sanford Consortium for Regenerative Medicine. Dr. Messi was born in Ankara, Turkey, and attended the Pierre and Marie Curie University in Paris in 2003, where she earned her bachelor's, master's, and PhD in neuroscience, working on Lou Gehrig's disease using mouse models. Upon joining Dr. Moultrie's lab, she has worked on human neurodevelopment and neurodevelopmental disorders, such as autism, using in vitro models such as brain organoids. She will discuss the Space Tango human brain organoids, an experiment that studies how microgravity affects small living masses of cells as a way to understand the effects of spaceflight on the brain. This investigation could pave the way for additional exploration of changes to neurons during spaceflight, including studies of pharmacology, disease, aging, and more. Dr. Messi.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. So I'm very happy to be here. This is actually our second mission with NASA and the ISS lab, and our mission is called BORD, that stands for Brain Organoid Advanced Research Developed in Space. And so what are brain organoids? They're miniaturized versions of a developing human brain that we generate from human skin cells most of the time, that are reprogrammed into what is called induced pluripotent stem cells that can give rise to any cell type in the human body. So we use these cells to generate different cells that we have in the human brain. And more recently, we have started generating these three-dimensional structures that we call brain organoids that can mimic both the cellular variety and the function of a developing brain, human brain. So why are we sending them to space? So as a couple of other researchers have touched on this question. So there's no other way of studying the impact of microgravity here on Earth. So this is one of the main reasons. But also recently, the NASA Twin study had shown us that extended periods of time spent in space could lead to accelerated aging. And this is actually a very interesting feature for us because we could use this feature to generate better human brain models. The current ones that we're studying, the brain organoids, are great for studying the human brain, but they actually mimic very early stages of the human brain. So they may not be that well suited for other diseases such as neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, etc., for which the age is actually the major risk factor. So by harnessing this feature of microgravity, we are aiming to have better human models to study the human brain. Also this NASA Twin study gave us some hints about the impact of space on the human body, but not enough to understand the underlying molecular and functional changes that happen to the human brain due to microgravity. So we're proposing that this brain organoid could be used as a experimental model. And then finally, we would like to, with this study, gather as much information as we can to really understand what staying in space does to a human brain, which is going to be very important for longer space expeditions, and also to understand how astronauts' cognitive function could potentially be impacted over time, and also to be prepared for space colonization one day. So this is a great opportunity to actually try to help mitigate the potential problems that would come with that in time. So to make this project happen, we actually partnered with Space Tango to automate and miniaturize our tissue culture conditions in a shoebox-sized device called a Cube Lab. Space Tango is a company that is an expert in custom-built automated platforms that enables R&D in the ISS, and they are able to support a variety of sciences. And actually, automation was very important for us because we wanted to have a higher reproducibility and accuracy in our experiments. And also the other advantage is that it requires really minimal work from the astronauts up in the ISS. And actually, to prepare for this mission over the last year, even with all the pandemic and all the hurdles that we have encountered, we still met online weekly, bi-weekly, and sometimes even more frequently than that with the Space Tango team to test out different components of the cube and distance. And so this was a great effort from both sides. And we're actually, I think, very happy that it finally came to fruition and can't wait to test it in the ISS. I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Messi. Reminder to reporters to press *1 to get in the queue to ask your question. In the meantime, can you tell us, what lessons you learned from your first mission?
Sure. So actually, the first mission, we're still analyzing some of the results, and it's not published yet. So unfortunately, I'm not able to share details about the results just yet. But in this second mission, we have learned a lot from the first mission. So our goal here is to increase the number of samples. So the first time we were able to do only 3 samples, and then now we're able to do 6. But we are also aiming to reproduce the results from the first mission to be able to be more confident about our analyses. And also we are excited about this new cell line that we introduced and generated brain organoids from that has been genetically modified to understand some of these mechanisms of aging. So we are also hoping that cell line will give us some better cues to understand how microgravity could lead to that accelerated aging feature that we have seen. We have also improved our automated system where now we can, as I was mentioning earlier, accommodate more samples and better imaging capabilities that are all going to be very helpful for analyzing the final data.
Okay, great. So you have, did you say 6 samples that are going up on this one?
Yes.
And how long is the investigation scheduled to take place?
It's going to be for 30 days. And then upon the when the 30 days are going to be over, the organoids are going to be stored in cold and brought back on Earth, and we're going to start analyzing. And we're actually going to conduct the same experiment here on ground as well to be able to compare them using the same cube, same automated system, same cell lines, same age of the brain organoids, to be able to really understand the differences between development of a brain organoid here on Earth versus in microgravity.
Okay, great. I'm not seeing any questions in the queue. I'll pause for a moment to see if any reporters want to press star 1 to get in the queue. Is there anything else that we should know about your investigation?
I think we're all very excited to test this new cube lab that I think we have really improved a lot from the first mission. So I think we really just want to see that work in the ISS, and also about the cell line that I was telling you about, this genetically modified cell line, to understand these, because basically this cell line is going to have an option where we can control the length of the telomeres in our chromosomes. So telomeres are these chunks of our genetic material that decreases in size over time, over each division. And upon a critical, when they arrive to a critical size, it's actually a cue for the cell to die. So we're very excited to test that system and see what will be the outcome in the brain organoid when the telomeres are shortened.
Cool. And Christina Anderson from AWPS News has a question.
Thank you for taking my question. So I'm curious about the telomeres. If you're able to shorten telomeres, does this have an impact on aging, not only in brain tissue, but potentially in other organs of the body? And is this something that can be transferred from space back to Earth as potential futuristic therapeutic against aging? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, these are all considerations that we're taking into account. It could be used potentially as a therapeutic for certain diseases where age is a major factor, perhaps for these neurodegenerative disorders that I was telling you about earlier. But also to make better models. So if we can mimic this aging feature in these brain organoids up in space, with these systems, we can also use those back on Earth to make better human models. So we can actually study adult human brain diseases in a much well-suited model.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Messi. And thank you to all of our scientists and researchers and folks who have participated today as our experts. We will give an opportunity for any lingering questions that reporters had for any of our scientists at this time. So if you have something that you wanted to ask that didn't get answered, now would be the time to press star 1 on your phone. Thank you for everyone's participation in this important science, research, and technology that is heading to the International Space Station on the next SpaceX cargo resupply mission. And as we've heard today, several of them are also flying back when that mission returns. The newly arrived Crew 1 astronauts, who are now part of the Expedition 64 crew, will be working on these as part of their 6-month science mission on the orbiting laboratory. I do see we have a question from Jeff South, Space News.
Hi, thanks for squeezing me in. I've got 2 questions, actually. One for David Brady. Since this is the first CRS mission with the new version of Dragon, I'm curious, beyond the additional payload capacity, if there are any capabilities that unlock new science that can be done on the space station using the spacecraft. And then for the bioasteroid team, I'm curious if you've conducted or planning to conduct similar experiments involving lunar regolith or lunar simulant regolith, since that might seem to be a more near-term application of this technology than using it on asteroids. Thanks.
Okay. Stephanie, if you don't mind, I'll go first.
Great.
Jeff, thank you for your question. Yeah, actually, one of the things we get off of Dragon is we're going to be able to double our power payload capacity there, which, as you may know, when you bring things up and down that are in cold conditions or have other reasons to need power for them, monitoring or some other reason, then that gives you additional capacity. Also, in general, we talk a lot about how the Commercial Crew Program is helping us out by doubling the amount of crew time for research. Some of the other things, though, that don't get quite as much coverage is the fact that when you have a capsule that you can launch from, the United States and recover near the United States, that means that it reduces the time from lab to launch pad and also from the landing site back to the lab. And this is particularly beneficial for our life science researchers, which often require special handling. I was just mentioning, like cold stowage. In addition, we're going to be able to get more science mass on our crew vehicles. When we were flying crews on Soyuz, it was on the order of tens of pounds or kilograms, and now we're talking about hundreds of pounds or kilograms. So all of this is particularly useful, as I said before, to life science, including human research that we're going to use not just for benefits for people here on the ground, but also for our astronauts in trying to solve some of the risks, understand some of the conditions that they have to deal with as we push out with the Artemis program to Gateway, to the moon, and beyond. I hope that answered your question. If not, I'll try again if you want to give me a follow-up.
Thank you, David. And if our bioasteroid team is still on the line, the second part of that question.
We are. Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. Yeah, so the question was, would follow-up experiments involve lunar regolith? In some sense, the BioRock experiment we did last year was using a lunar analog in that we looked at basalt, which is a very common constituent of the lunar surface. Of course, it's slightly different on the moon. It's more reduced. It hasn't been as oxidized as the Earth's environment. So ideally, it would be nice to do this experiment with real lunar regolith, and lunar regolith has also been processed by gardening impact events over billions of years. So really, ideally, you would want to go to the moon and take the bioasteroid, BioRock apparatus and put real lunar regolith in there and do a small biomining experiment. And certainly with commercial opportunities to the moon that are coming online, we had a collaboration, for example, with the Milo Institute at Arizona State University. So we've already made some moves in the direction of trying to do some of these experiments on the surface of the moon itself. That would be one of the next exciting steps.
Great, thank you. And we'll take one last question from Marcia Dunn of the Associated Press.
Yes, hi. Again, for the bioasteroid team. I wasn't sure when you mentioned 1 gram of this asteroid, crushed asteroid. I wasn't sure if that was all together or 1 gram per 12 mini bioreactors that you were talking about. And again, it was broken up. I think I understood 1 to 2 billion of these microorganisms per 5 milliliters. Again, is that all together, or is that for each of these 12 mini bioreactors? And lastly, is this material all from the same asteroid, and when and where was it found here on Earth? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. So it's crushed up material, and that's 1 gram per reactor. So there's 12 of these reactors, so 12 grams in total. So there's 1 gram in each culture chamber, and that number of microbes is per culture chamber. So the microbes are dried down on the rock, and then they're activated in the fluid once they get into space. So that's the answer to that part of the question. And the asteroid material actually comes from the deserts of Morocco, where people collect in deserts are very common places to collect meteorites. It's because they're easier to find there. You can see the fusion crust, so people can pick them up relatively easily from the background rocky material. And this is an L chondrite, which is a low iron content chondrite, fairly common type of asteroidal material out there in space. So it's a good representative type of geological material that we might one day expect to be using in life support systems or in bioindustrial processes beyond Earth.
Fantastic, thank you. Thanks again to everybody, both our scientists, experts, and reporters for participating today, and all of those listening online. Please stay tuned to nasa.gov/SpaceX for more details about the upcoming launch and mission and the coverage on NASA TV. And you can follow along with our researchers, our astronauts in these studies in orbit online at nasa.gov/ISS-science. You can listen to a replay of this teleconference by dialing 1-800-964-3385. Thank you for joining us and have a lovely Friday afternoon.
That concludes today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may disconnect at this time. Speakers will have a moment of silence and stand by for your post-conference. That concludes today's conference. Thank you for participating. You may disconnect at this time. Speakers will have a moment of silence and stand by for your post-conference.